Have you ever wondered if the most important person in your future is someone you have already met in your past, a ghost from a time you have long forgotten, waiting for the universe to circle back around? We walk through our lives assuming that time is a straight line, that the people we leave behind in childhood playgrounds and dusty classrooms stay there forever, frozen in sepia-toned memories. But sometimes, life has a way of folding back on itself like a map. For Maya, a woman who had spent the better part of her 27 years trying to make herself as small and unnoticeable as possible, the idea of destiny felt like a luxury reserved for other people, for the ones who walked with their heads high and their voices loud. Maya wore the dark blue uniform of the nighttime cleaning crew like a suit of armor, a garment designed to render her invisible against the beige walls and gray carpets of the towering corporate high-rise where she worked. She was beautiful, though she rarely let anyone see it, hiding her expressive eyes and warm smile behind a curtain of professional detachment and the rhythmic, hypnotic motion of a polishing cloth. Every night was the same quiet ritual, a symphony of solitude, where the only sounds were the hum of the industrial vacuum and the distant, muffled traffic of the city below, a world that seemed to move on without her. She preferred it this way. Or at least that is what she told herself, because invisibility was safe, and in a city that could be cold and unforgiving, safety was the only currency that mattered. The building she cleaned was a fortress of glass and steel, housing an international shipping conglomerate that rumors said was merely a front for something much older and much more dangerous, a place where men in sharp suits spoke in hushed tones and security cameras watched every shadow. Maya kept her head down, did her work with meticulous care, and never asked questions, because she knew that in a place like this, curiosity was the quickest way to lose a job, or perhaps something more valuable. She moved through the corridors like a whisper, her presence marked only by the scent of lemon polish and the gleaming surfaces she left behind, a ghost haunting the halls of the powerful, never imagining that the power she feared was about to look back at her. The mistake happened on a Tuesday, the kind of night where the rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows and the thunder rattled the bones of the building, distracting Maya just enough to make her miss the memo about the restricted suite on the top floor. Usually, the penthouse offices were off-limits to the regular crew, serviced only by a specialized team that came in during the day, but the schedule had shifted, or maybe she had misread the clipboard in her exhaustion, and so she found herself pushing her cart into the sanctuary of the director. The room was unlike the sterile, modern boxes she cleaned on the lower levels. This space was a cavern of mahogany and leather, smelling of expensive tobacco, aged paper, and a sharp, clean cologne that triggered a vague, inexplicable familiarity in the back of her mind. It was imposing and masculine, a room that commanded respect even when it was empty, with a massive desk that looked more like a throne sitting before a panoramic view of the storm-drenched city skyline. Maya hesitated, her heart beating a little faster as the heavy door clicked shut behind her, sealing her in the silence, but her work ethic overrode her anxiety, and she began to dust, her hands moving with practiced grace over the bookshelves and the side tables. She reached the main desk, intending to quickly wipe down the surface and leave, but as she moved a stack of leather-bound files to clean the wood beneath, her hand brushed against a small, ornate silver frame that had been turned slightly inward, facing the chair where the director would sit. Curiosity, that dangerous impulse she always tried to suppress, made her tilt her head to see what kind of man ran an empire like this, expecting to see a photo of a stern father, a trophy wife, or perhaps a sleek yacht. Instead, what she saw made the blood drain from her face and her breath catch in her throat, her hand trembling so violently that she almost knocked the heavy frame onto the glass surface of the desk. The photo was old, the colors faded into the soft, nostalgic hues of the late 90s, capturing two children sitting on a rusted swing set in a sun-drenched park, sharing a melting vanilla ice cream cone. One child was a young Korean boy with a serious expression and a Band-Aid on his knee, and the other was a little African-American girl with braids and a gap-toothed smile, laughing at the camera with a joy that Maya had not felt in years. She knew that smile because she saw the ghost of it in the mirror every morning. The girl in the photo was her, And the boy was a memory she had buried under decades of survival and struggle, a childhood friend named Ji-hoon whom she hadn't seen since the day the social workers came. Panic is a cold thing, a sudden douse of ice water that sharpens the senses even as it clouds the judgment, and for a moment, Maya stood frozen in the center of the lion's den, the silver frame burning in her vision like a warning flare. Why did the director of a shadowy international syndicate, a man rumored to have connections to the Korean Mafia, have a picture of a poor foster kid on his desk? The implications spiraled through her mind, terrifying and nonsensical, clashing with the mundane reality of her vacuum cleaner and her spray bottles. She carefully, agonizingly slowly, placed the frame back exactly as she had found it, ensuring the angle was precise, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She needed to leave. She needed to vanish. She needed to be anywhere but here, because if this man was who the whispers said he was, then being connected to him, even through a 20-year-old photograph, was dangerous. She grabbed her cart, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle, and backed out of the room, wiping the door handle with her apron to remove any fingerprints, her mind racing with a mixture of fear and a sudden, aching nostalgia that she couldn't suppress. She hurried down the corridor, the sound of her own footsteps seeming impossibly loud on the plush carpet, and didn't stop until she reached the service elevator, jamming the button with a frantic urgency. When the doors finally slid open, she nearly collided with Elena, the older woman who acted as the unofficial mother hen of the night shift, a stout and kind-hearted soul who knew everything that happened in the building. Elena grabbed Maya's arm to steady her, her eyes widening as she took in Maya's pale face and trembling hands. She whispered a question, asking if Maya had seen a ghost, and Maya could only nod, unable to explain that the ghost she had seen was herself, trapped in a silver frame in the office of a monster. She didn't tell Elena what she had found. She couldn't, not when the rumors about the director included stories of people disappearing for knowing too much. Instead, she blamed the thunder, blamed the creepy silence of the top floor, and let Elena lead her to the break room for a cup of terrible vending machine tea, her hands shaking as she held the paper cup, the image of the boy's serious, protective face burned into her retinas. The atmosphere in the building shifted the next evening, the air growing heavy and electric, as if the building itself was holding its breath in anticipation of a storm that had nothing to do with the weather. Maya tried to call in sick, to hide in her small apartment and pretend the world outside didn't exist, but she couldn't afford to lose a shift, and so she returned, her stomach in knots, keeping her head lower than ever. When she arrived, the service entrance was buzzing with tension, the security guards standing straighter, their hands resting near their belts, their eyes scanning the staff with renewed suspicion. The word had come down that the director, a man who usually worked remotely or traveled abroad, was in the building, and his presence sent a ripple of anxiety through the entire staff, from the executives on the 45th floor to the cleaners in the basement. Ji-hoon, known to his subordinates only as the boss, or Mr. Park, moved through the lobby like a shark cutting through water, his presence commanding silence without him ever having to raise his voice. He was 36 now, devastatingly handsome in a way that felt dangerous, wearing a tailored suit that cost more than Maya would earn in a lifetime, his face an unreadable mask of cold authority. But beneath that icy exterior, his mind was racing, fixated on a detail so small that anyone else would have missed it. When he had entered his office earlier that day, he had noticed immediately that the air smelled faintly of lemons, a scent that didn't belong in his world of leather and smoke, and more importantly, the silver frame on his desk had been moved, shifted by perhaps a millimeter, but to a man who lived by noticing what didn't fit, it was a scream. He didn't fly into a rage. He didn't call the police. Instead, he sat in his chair, staring at the photo of the only person who had ever made him feel safe, and felt a strange, dormant hope stirring in his chest. He called for Manager Hendricks, the head of building operations, a man with a thin face and shifting eyes who enjoyed the power he held over the custodial staff a little too much. Ji-hoon's voice was low, smooth, and terrifyingly calm as he gave the order. He wanted to know exactly who had cleaned the top floor the previous night. He didn't want them fired, and he didn't want them hurt. He simply wanted to see them. The hunt began quietly, but to Maya, it felt like the walls were closing in, the surveillance cameras and the hallways turning to follow her movements like the eyes of predators. Manager Hendricks descended into the break room during the shift change, his presence sucking the warmth out of the room, holding a clipboard like a weapon as he scanned the faces of the women in blue uniforms. He called out names, checking schedules, his voice dripping with an oily superiority that made Maya's skin crawl. She stood in the back, trying to blend into the row of lockers, hoping that her mistake had gone unnoticed, that perhaps the logbook hadn't been updated to reflect her unauthorized detour to the penthouse. But Hendricks was thorough, a bureaucrat who delighted in finding errors, and his finger stopped on a line in the ledger, his eyes narrowing as he looked up and scanned the room until his gaze landed on her. He called her name, not with respect, but with the tone one uses for a problematic appliance, and summoned her to the front. The room went silent, Elena shooting Maya a worried glance, mouthing a silent prayer. Maya stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to hide their trembling, her heart pounding so hard she could hear the blood rushing in her ears. Hendricks demanded to know if she had been on the top floor, his voice rising, accusing her of negligence, of violating protocol, of potentially stealing, though he had no proof. Maya kept her eyes on her shoes, whispering a quiet apology, admitting she had cleaned the room but denying she had touched anything other than the dust. It was a half-truth, the only shield she had. Hendricks sneered, ready to dismiss her, to throw her out into the street for her insolence, but before he could speak the words, the door to the break room opened. It wasn't a slam, but a controlled, deliberate opening that drew every eye. Standing there, flanked by 2 large security personnel, was Ji-hoon. He didn't look at Hendricks. He didn't look at the other cleaners. His dark, intense eyes locked immediately onto Maya, piercing through her blue uniform, through her fear, and straight into the memory of the girl he had lost 20 years ago. The room went deathly still, the air thick with unspoken danger, as the Korean Mafia boss stepped into the cleaners' break room, searching for the ghost from his past. Manager Hendricks froze, his mouth hanging open mid-tirade, the venomous words he had been spewing suddenly turning to ash in his throat as the atmosphere in the cramped break room shifted from administrative bullying to something far more primal and terrifying. The silence that descended was absolute, heavy with the scent of floor wax and stale coffee, as Ji-hoon walked past the stunned manager as if the man were nothing more than a piece of office furniture, his focus entirely consumed by the woman standing near the lockers with her head bowed. To the other cleaning staff, this was a scene from a nightmare, the arrival of the apex predator in their sanctuary, but for Maya, the terror was mixed with a strange, magnetic pull that vibrated in her chest, a resonance that felt like a song she had forgotten how to hum. Ji-hoon stopped just a foot away from her, close enough that she could smell the rain on his coat and the subtle, expensive cologne that had haunted her memory since the night before, and he waited, his presence demanding acknowledgement without him saying a word. Slowly, painfully, Maya lifted her gaze, her brown eyes meeting his dark, intense stare, and in that moment, the years dissolved, the gray walls of the break room melted away, and she was just a girl on a swing set again, looking at the boy who had promised to protect her from the neighborhood bullies. Ji-hoon's expression, usually a mask of stone-cold indifference that terrified his board members and rivals alike, softened into something that looked agonizingly like relief, his eyes tracing the familiar curve of her jaw and the scar on her eyebrow that she had gotten falling off a bicycle when she was 7. He ignored the gaping security guards and the sweating manager, reaching out a hand, not to grab her, but to gently, reverently tuck a stray braid behind her ear, a gesture so intimate and tender that a collective gasp went through the room. He spoke then, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, ignoring the hierarchy that said he shouldn't speak to the help, and asked her simply if she remembered the flavor of the ice cream, a code they had shared a lifetime ago when the world was too big and they were too small. Maya, tears pricking the corners of her eyes, whispered the answer, vanilla with sprinkles, and saw the ghost of a smile touch his lips, a crack in the armor of the king of the high-rise. He turned then to Hendricks, the warmth vanishing instantly as he addressed the manager with a voice like a blade, informing him that he was never to speak to this woman with anything less than the respect due to a queen, leaving the manager stammering and pale as Ji-hoon gently placed a hand on the small of Maya's back and guided her out of the room, leading her away from the chemicals and the uniforms and into a world she thought she had lost forever. The elevator ride up to the penthouse was a study in silence, but unlike the terrifying quiet of the service elevator, this silence was charged with an electric current of unanswered questions and suppressed longing, the air between them thick enough to touch. Maya stood in the corner, clutching her apron as if it were a shield, acutely aware of the grease stain on her sleeve and the scuffs on her work shoes, feeling like an imposter in the gilded cage of steel and glass that rose higher and higher above the city. Ji-hoon stood near the doors, his posture rigid, his hands clenched in fists at his sides as if he were fighting the urge to reach out and make sure she was real, that she wasn't a hallucination conjured by his exhaustion and his regrets. When the doors opened, revealing the expansive, dimly lit office that she had fled from the night before, he didn't go to his desk. Instead, he led her to the floor-to-ceiling windows where the city lights sprawled out below them like a carpet of diamonds, a view usually reserved for the gods of industry. He turned to her, stripping off his suit jacket and tossing it onto a chair, the removal of the layer symbolizing a shedding of his role, his status, and his power, leaving him just a man standing before a woman he had spent 20 years missing. He walked over to the desk and picked up the silver frame, holding it out to her like an offering, his voice trembling slightly as he confessed that he had kept it on every desk he had ever owned, from his first cramped office in a basement to this fortress in the sky. He told her about the day the social workers had come, how he had fought and screamed as they dragged him to a different car, how he had been moved to a family in Seoul, and then back to the States, always looking for the girl with the gap-toothed smile who had been the only family he ever really had. Maya listened, the tears finally spilling over her cheeks, realizing that while she had been trying to make herself invisible to survive, he had been building an empire just to be visible enough for her to find him. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to wipe a tear from her cheek, his thumb rough against her skin, and told her that he didn't care about the dust or the uniform or the years that had passed. He only cared that the empty space in his life, the void that no amount of money or power could fill, was finally occupied. The romance of the moment wasn't in grand gestures or fireworks, but in the quiet, devastating intimacy of being known, of being seen completely by the one person who remembered who you were before the world told you who you had to be. But the world outside the penthouse windows was not as forgiving as the sanctuary they had created, and the ripples of their reunion began to spread through the building with the speed and toxicity of a virus. By the next morning, the rumor mill was churning with vicious efficiency, fueled by the jealousy of the administrative staff and the vindictive spite of manager Hendricks, who felt his authority crumbling and needed a scapegoat to restore his fragile ego. Whispers followed Maya through the corridors, sharp and cruel, suggesting that she was using her position to seduce the director, that she was a gold digger who had manipulated her way into the penthouse, stripping her of her dignity and reducing her life of hard work to a sordid office scandal. The atmosphere in the cleaning crew break room, once her place of refuge, turned cold and hostile, with even Elena looking at her with a mixture of pity and confusion, unable to reconcile the shy girl she knew with the woman who was now being chauffeured home in a black sedan. The threat escalated when a rival faction within the company, men who had long waited for a sign of weakness in Ji-hoon's armor, seized upon the rumors as a weapon, planning to use his distraction with a member of the cleaning staff as proof of his instability and lack of focus. They began to dig into Maya's background, looking for dirt, for debts, for anything they could use to leverage against him, turning her anonymity into a liability. Maya felt the pressure mounting, the heavy, suffocating weight of being a pawn in a game she didn't understand, and for a moment, the old instinct to run, to disappear into the shadows where it was safe, nearly overwhelmed her. She tried to tell Ji-hoon that it wasn't worth it, that she would leave the job and vanish so his reputation would remain intact, but he silenced her with a look of fierce, burning intensity. He found her in the library of the office, where she had retreated to hide from the glares of the secretaries, and took her hands in his grip iron tight. He told her that he had spent half his life building walls to keep people out, but he would burn the entire building to the ground before he let anyone make her feel small again. This wasn't just about affection. It was about defiance, about proving that the bond they shared was stronger than the artificial hierarchies of their world. And as he kissed her forehead, a protective promise sealed in the silence, Maya realized that for the first time in her life, she didn't have to be strong alone. The breaking point came 3 days later at the annual shareholders' gala, an event of opulent excess held in the building's grand ballroom, where the city's elite gathered to drink champagne and broker deals under the guise of charity. Hendricks, in a last-ditch effort to humiliate Maya and regain his standing with the rival board members, had manipulated the shift schedule to ensure Maya was assigned to clean the restrooms near the ballroom, forcing her to be present in her uniform while the people she had cleaned up after partied in silk and diamonds. The contrast was cruel and deliberate, designed to put her in her place, to show Ji-hoon that his friend was nothing more than a servant. As the night went on, a drunken board member, instigated by Hendricks, accidentally spilled a tray of red wine across the marble floor near the entrance and loudly summoned Maya to clean it up, snapping his fingers as if she were a dog. The music died down, the chatter stopped, and the room turned to watch the spectacle, the wealthy onlookers staring with detached amusement as Maya knelt with her rag, her face burning with shame, feeling the familiar sting of invisibility wrapping around her throat. She scrubbed at the wine, the red stain looking like blood on the white stone, wishing the floor would open up and swallow her whole. But then, the heavy double doors at the top of the stairs burst open, not with a bang, but with the force of a sudden atmospheric pressure change. Ji-hoon stood there, not in his usual dark suit, but in a tuxedo that made him look like a prince of darkness, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on the scene at the entrance. He didn't shout. He didn't make a scene. He simply walked down the grand staircase, the crowd parting for him like the Red Sea, his eyes locked on Maya. He reached the spot where she knelt, and without a moment's hesitation, he dropped to his knees beside her on the hard marble, ruining his bespoke trousers in the spilled wine. A gasp went through the room, shocked whispers fluttering like birds, as the most powerful man in the city took the rag from her trembling hands and tossed it aside. He took her hands, stained red with wine, and kissed her knuckles, looking up at the board member with a gaze so terrifyingly calm that the man took a stumble backward. Ji-hoon stood up, pulling Maya up with him, and addressed the room, his voice ringing clear and steady, declaring that the woman beside him was not a servant, but the only person in the room who knew the true value of loyalty and survival, introducing her not as his cleaner, but as the co-architect of his future. In the weeks that followed, the high-rise underwent a transformation that was less about renovation and more about a cultural exorcism, as the toxic elements of the old regime were systematically purged. Hendricks was gone before the sun rose the next morning, escorted out by the same security guards he had once ordered around, and the atmosphere in the building shifted from one of fear to one of cautious respect. Maya did not return to the night shift, but she didn't disappear into the idle life of a trophy wife either. Instead, with Ji-hoon's support, she enrolled in the university art program she had been forced to abandon years ago, her sketches of the city's skyline now drawn from the perspective of someone looking out, not someone looking down. The romance between them deepened, not into a whirlwind of flashy dates, but into a steady, quiet rhythm of shared mornings and late-night conversations, a love built on the foundation of their shared scars. One evening, months later, they returned to the park where the photo had been taken, the rusted swing set long gone, replaced by a modern play structure, but the feeling of the place remained the same. It was autumn, and the leaves were turning gold and crimson, crunching under their feet as they walked hand in hand, no longer a boss and a maid, but just a man and a woman who had survived the storm. They sat on a bench, watching the sun dip below the horizon, and Ji-hoon pulled out a new camera, snapping a picture of Maya as she laughed at something he said, capturing the light in her eyes that was no longer hidden. He showed her the digital image, placing it side by side with the old photo he still carried in his wallet, the two images bridging a 20-year gap of pain and longing. Maya rested her head on his shoulder, the silence between them no longer filled with things unsaid, but with the comfortable peace of a promise kept. The universe, it seemed, did not move in a straight line, but in a circle, bringing them back to where they started, not to relive the past, but to understand that every swept floor, every lonely night, and every moment of invisibility had been a step on the long, winding road back to each other, proving that even the smallest, most forgotten people can leave the deepest echoes in the hearts of those who truly see them.